Let us begin with a question that almost nobody in Washington thought to ask before the bombs fell in late February. Who actually controls the Strait of Hormuz? It sounds like the kind of question you would find in a freshman geopolitics textbook. Obvious, almost embarrassing to raise. And yet, the most powerful military planners on Earth, sitting in the most well-funded national security apparatus in human history, appear to have never seriously gamed out the answer. Or if they did, they dismissed what they found. And that dismissal, that breathtaking combination of arrogance and strategic illiteracy, is the thread you have to pull if you want to understand how the United States ended up in a position where its vice president is flying to Switzerland to negotiate terms with a country it thought it had already broken. Let me explain what I mean. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a waterway. It is the economic jugular of the modern world. Roughly 20% of all global oil supply passes through that narrow channel. Every tanker moving petroleum from the Persian Gulf to Europe, to Asia, to American allies and American markets must pass through it. Iran sits on one bank, and Iran has missiles, a lot of them, sophisticated ones that have proven in the weeks and months since this war escalated that they can reach American military bases scattered across the Gulf region. Ones that can, and did, reach Israeli targets. Ones that quietly, devastatingly, altered the entire balance of what was supposed to be a quick and surgical American victory. The puzzling thing, the thing that historians will argue about for decades, is that none of this was secret. Iran's missile capabilities were well documented. Iran's geographic position astride the strait was not a surprise. And yet, when the decision was made to escalate militarily in February, the dominant theory of victory inside the American national security establishment was that air power alone could knock Iran out of the fight in days, before any of these asymmetric cards could be played. The strait would never even become relevant, because the war would be over before Iran could shut it down. This is what military strategists sometimes call a theory of victory built on a single optimistic assumption. When that assumption collapses, so does everything else. The assumption collapsed almost immediately. Within the first days of the conflict, as it became clear this would not be a repeat of the 12-day skirmish from the prior June, which itself had ended with the Israelis quietly relieved to stop fighting, the Iranians began to understand something they had not fully grasped before the shooting started. They were holding a remarkably powerful hand. The strait gave them economic leverage over the entire industrialized world. Their missiles gave them the capacity to inflict serious damage on adversaries who had assumed they were untouchable. And their willingness to actually use both of these tools transformed what Washington had envisioned as a brief punitive expedition into something far more complicated and far more dangerous. There is a certain dark irony here that deserves to be named. The Iranians, by most accounts, did not fully understand their own strength on the eve of the war either. They were not sitting in Tehran on February 27th, calmly confident that they would outmaneuver the Americans. They were, like everyone else, operating with incomplete information and imperfect foresight. The difference is that once the war began and they began to understand what they had, they used it. The Americans and Israelis, by contrast, seem to have remained committed to a narrative of inevitable victory, even as the evidence on the ground told a different story. This is one of the more consistent patterns in the history of modern American military adventurism. The gap between the official narrative and the battlefield reality tends to widen steadily, quietly, until it becomes impossible to maintain. And then the reckoning comes, not in the form of an honest accounting, but in the form of a frantic search for an exit. That exit is now being negotiated in Switzerland, and the terms, from everything that can be pieced together, amount to a significant capitulation to Iranian demands. The economic catastrophe that the Strait of Hormuz closure threatened, and to some extent continues to threaten, given that the strait remains only partially open as of this conversation, has concentrated the minds of American decision-makers in a way that no amount of strategic analysis, apparently managed to do beforehand. There is something worth pausing on here. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve, which exists precisely for moments of supply disruption, has limits. The Commercial Petroleum Reserve has limits. And when the global economy begins to feel the sustained pressure of constricted oil supply, the political consequences are not abstract. They are felt at petrol stations, in food prices, in the cost of manufacturing and transport, in the quarterly earnings of every company that moves physical goods across the world. This is not a theoretical concern, it is an immediate one. And it is the reason that the American position in these negotiations has moved steadily and unmistakably toward accommodation. The question that hangs over all of this is what Israel does next. Israel's position in this conflict is genuinely peculiar, and understanding it requires stepping back from the immediate headlines and thinking about the structural situation the country finds itself in. Israel is a small, militarily capable state that has, over the past several decades, become deeply dependent on American support. This was not always the case. In the early decades of Israeli statehood, and certainly among the Zionist pioneers before 1948, there was a strong ideological commitment to self-reliance. The understanding was that in an anarchic world where no state can ultimately be trusted to protect another, Israel had to be able to protect itself. American support was welcome, even sought, but dependence on it was understood to be a strategic vulnerability. That principle has eroded significantly. The wars Israel has been able to wage, the scale of force it has been able to project, the assassination campaigns it has been able to sustain across the Middle East, the operations in Gaza, in Lebanon, the ongoing occupation infrastructure, none of it would be sustainable without American military aid, American diplomatic cover, and American willingness to absorb the reputational costs of association. Israel has become, in a structural sense, a client state that behaves like a regional hegemon. The contradiction at the heart of that arrangement is now visibly straining. When the American president publicly signals that he believes the continuation of this war risks economic catastrophe, and when the vice president is personally engaged in de-escalation talks, it means the patron has decided that the client's strategic adventure has gone too far. The question is whether the client understands this, and whether it has the capacity to respond rationally. The signals coming from certain quarters of Israeli political life suggest that the answer to both questions is, at minimum, uncertain. Consider what it means when a senior Israeli official publicly calls for all of Lebanon to be treated as a military target. When the same official describes his approach to the Lebanese population in terms borrowed from the logic of collective punishment and total war. When rhetoric of this kind is not treated as disqualifying, but is instead normalized as one position among several in a legitimate political debate. This is not a peripheral voice. This is someone who commands significant institutional power and whose political support is structurally necessary for the current government's survival. What this tells you, and this is the harder, more uncomfortable analysis, is that the problem is not simply one of leadership. It is not the case that if you removed certain individuals from positions of power, the underlying strategic culture would immediately correct itself. The polling data on Israeli public opinion regarding the conduct of the war, regarding the treatment of civilian populations in conflict zones, regarding the expansion of military operations, that data does not suggest a society with a median view that is dramatically more moderate than its most vocal political figures. The extremism is not a distortion of public sentiment. In many respects, it is a reflection of it. How did this happen? This is the question that serious analysts of Israeli society will need to grapple with honestly. And it is a question without a comfortable answer. Several factors seem relevant. Decades of continuous conflict create a psychology of siege that is very difficult to dislodge, even when the objective strategic situation changes. The internal narrative that the entire world is hostile, that opposition to Israeli policy is always a mask for deeper prejudice, functions as a closed epistemic system that makes genuine self-assessment nearly impossible. And the experience of unconditional American support has perversely undermined the kind of strategic discipline that comes from knowing you might actually have to bear the consequences of your decisions. When there is always a patron willing to absorb the costs, The incentive structure that normally constrains state behavior begins to dissolve. The result is a political culture that has, in the assessment of many serious observers, lost its capacity for the kind of sober strategic calculation that characterizes effective statecraft. Not because the people involved lack intelligence, but because the feedback mechanisms that normally correct strategic error, real costs, real consequences, real accountability, have been systematically muted. What does this mean for the negotiations now underway? The American position, stripped of diplomatic language, is this: the war needs to end because the economic consequences of its continuation are intolerable. The specific terms being negotiated include an Israeli withdrawal from southern Lebanon and a cessation of the bombing campaigns. Iran's position is that it will move toward fully reopening the strait once these conditions are met. The underlying logic is transactional. You stop doing the things that give us leverage to hurt you, and we stop hurting you. The complication is that the Israeli government, or significant elements within it, appears to resist this arrangement. And the resistance is not entirely cynical. There is a genuine belief, held sincerely by people who are not simply performing for domestic audiences, that any accommodation represents surrender, that the war can still be prosecuted to a favorable conclusion, that the costs being incurred are bearable. This belief is, by most objective measures, disconnected from the military and economic reality. But beliefs do not need to be accurate to be politically powerful. The American response to this resistance will be determinative. There is a version of events in which the pressure applied is sufficient to move Israeli decision-making, in which the combination of public American statements, the scale of the economic stakes, and whatever private leverage exists is enough to force a policy change. The polling data that shows a large majority of Americans supporting the deal is not irrelevant here. There is domestic political space for an American president to push hard on Israel in a way that would have seemed unthinkable 5 years ago. The reputational damage Israel has sustained in American public opinion over the past 2 years is real and cumulative. There is another version of events in which the resistance holds long enough to derail the deal, in which the coalition dynamics inside the Israeli government prove more powerful than external pressure, and the negotiations in Switzerland collapse. The consequences of that outcome would be severe and widely distributed, and the question of who bears the blame for them would, in that scenario, become a central feature of the political landscape in multiple countries simultaneously. What I find analytically important about this moment, and what I think tends to get lost in the day-to-day coverage of statements and counterstatements, is that it represents something more than a diplomatic episode. It represents a structural inflection point in a relationship that has defined American Middle East policy for decades. The unconditional quality of American support for Israeli military operations has been a fixture of the strategic landscape for so long that many practitioners and observers have stopped treating it as a variable. It is simply assumed, factored in, part of the background. But the economic consequences of this particular war have made it a variable again. When the strait is partially closed and the global economy is straining, the cost of the patron-client relationship becomes visible in a way it has not been before. And visible costs create political pressure that was not previously present. This does not mean the relationship is ending. It does not mean American support for Israel will evaporate. But it may mean that the terms of that support are being renegotiated, tacitly, without anyone formally declaring that this is happening, in the way that the terms of most significant relationships are renegotiated when circumstances change enough to make the old terms untenable. There is a historical parallel worth considering here. It is not a perfect parallel, no historical parallel ever is, but it is instructive. The relationship between Britain and certain of its allies in the early post-Second World War period underwent a similar kind of quiet renegotiation as British power contracted and the costs of maintaining imperial-era commitments became unsustainable. The formal structures of the relationship often persisted long after the underlying reality had shifted. The language of alliance and solidarity continued to be used even as the practical content of that alliance was being quietly revised. The adjustment was real, but rarely announced. Something analogous may be occurring now. The language of the special relationship, the ritual affirmations of shared values and strategic partnership, these will continue. But the practical meaning of unconditional support, the thing that allowed a client state to act as though it faced no binding constraints, may be quietly, durably changing. Whether that change is sufficient to alter the strategic trajectory of the region in any meaningful way is a separate question, and an honest answer requires acknowledging enormous uncertainty. The structural forces that have driven the conflict, the unresolved questions of Palestinian political status, the Iranian strategic calculation that its survival requires regional power projection, the domestic political dynamics within Israel that reward hardline positions, the American domestic political economy that has historically made Israel policy unusually resistant to normal foreign policy recalibration, none of these disappear because of one difficult war and one difficult negotiation. What this moment does is create a window in which the costs of the current trajectory are visible to decision makers in a way they often are not. Windows of this kind are historically associated with the possibility of genuine change, but also, very commonly, with the phenomenon of a window closing without producing change, followed by a return to familiar patterns once the immediate crisis passes. The question is whether anyone, in any of the relevant capitals, is capable of perceiving the moment clearly enough and acting boldly enough to do something durable with it. Iran will almost certainly emerge from this conflict with a significantly enhanced sense of its own strategic leverage. The lesson it has drawn, that it can resist military pressure from the most powerful military coalition in the region, inflict real costs on that coalition through asymmetric means, and negotiate from a position of genuine strength, is a lesson that will shape its strategic calculations for years. It will invest in the capabilities that prove decisive in this conflict. It will extend those capabilities to partners who share its regional interests. It will be harder to coerce the next time. This is not a prediction of Iranian behavior as some kind of moral judgment. It is simply what states do when they discover which of their capabilities are effective and which of their adversaries' threats are hollow. The strategic logic is almost mechanical. For the United States, the reckoning is less clear but no less significant. There is a version of American strategic culture that learns from this, that absorbs the lesson that air power without a viable theory of victory is not a strategy, that controlling a strait is a form of power that does not require aircraft carriers, that the economic consequences of military action must be seriously modeled before the action is taken. There is another version of American strategic culture that processes this as an anomaly, a case where things went wrong due to bad luck or bad execution, and that draws no structural lessons at all. Which version prevails will depend, in part, on whether the people who made the initial decisions are held accountable in any meaningful sense, in congressional testimony, in public debate, in the historical record. Accountability is not primarily about punishment. It is about the institutional learning that cannot occur when failure is never honestly named. What we are watching, in the most fundamental sense, is the ongoing unraveling of a strategic paradigm that has governed American engagement in the Middle East for decades. The paradigm held that American military supremacy was so overwhelming and the costs of defying it so prohibitive that adversaries would rationally submit rather than resist. The corollary was that any adversary foolish enough to resist would be quickly and decisively punished in a way that would reinforce the deterrent message for everyone else. This paradigm has been under strain for a long time. The history of the past 2 decades offers many examples of military power that was overwhelming in technical terms, but insufficient to produce the political outcomes it was deployed to achieve. But the Strait episode, the discovery that a second-tier military power could impose real economic costs on the most powerful country in the world by exploiting a geographic choke point with missiles, represents a particularly clear and direct challenge to the core assumptions. How that challenge is processed, whether it produces genuine strategic adaptation, or whether it is papered over and forgotten, Maybe the most consequential question raised by this conflict, long after the immediate negotiations are concluded and the strait is fully open again. And so we return to the question we started with, but from a very different angle. Who controls the Strait of Hormuz? The technical answer is that Iran sits on its northern shore and has the capability to disrupt traffic through it. The deeper answer is that control over critical choke points, whether maritime straits, energy infrastructure, financial networks, constitutes a form of power that the modern world's most militarily capable state has not found a reliable way to neutralize. And any strategic framework that does not take that seriously is not a strategic framework. It is a fantasy dressed in the language of strategy. The war, nobody fully understood. Not the Americans, not the Israelis, not even the Iranians at the outset, has produced a clarifying moment. What gets done with that clarity is, as always, a matter of human choice. And human choices, as history is tireless in demonstrating, are far less rational, far less consistent, and far less responsive to obvious evidence than any clean analytical framework would lead us to expect. That is the uncomfortable place where this analysis has to end. Not with a neat conclusion, but with an honest accounting of the uncertainty that remains and the seriousness of what happens if that uncertainty is resolved in the wrong direction.